Welcome to the World Community Church. Thank you for joining us. This week we have Geoff and Geraldine Booker who are going to share what's on their heart and also give us an update on the Quicken Trust. It's Sunday, the 10th of January 2021. We hope you enjoy this. Thank you.
For the warm welcome. It would be even a warmer welcome if we could give everybody a hug, but we'll accept where we are because that's where we are today. And so first thing I want to do is to thank you for sharing those things from the website, but from our point of view, it's thank you for being a partner with us and therefore a partner with God on this for so many years. You've had a great long-term commitment to the work that God called us to do, so thank you for that. Just a little update. Eric, who is the last of your three students, is finishing his law degree and he is a committed Christian. So he's going to have a wonderful future ahead of him. Absolutely. Thank you, Nigel, for that applause. That's great. Now, I want to read you, first of all, something from a daily reading guide that we actually use for 3 or 4 years. It's called Choose Life. I don't know if any of you know it. It's by Simon Gillibald, who worked out in Burundi for many years. But each day, I mean, it varies between reports about different people's lives and also some thoughts on what God is speaking or saying or something today. But this one it was actually for August the 17th. And it's Isaiah 6 verse 8, "Here I am, send me," is how he's headed it. And it's about the calling of a young man called Robert Jermaine Thomas. And today we are looking at calling to a certain extent, hoping to share that with you and share it amongst ourselves as well. But as is written in this book, it says, in 1866, he felt God's call to penetrate Korea with the gospel following a massacre of about 8,000 local believers by the antagonistic regime. In human eyes, it was foolish to respond. However, despite the nagging temptation to resist God's call, Thomas boarded a US trading vessel and sailed up the Pyongyang, the river. Despite repeated warnings to turn back, they kept going until they were stranded on a sandbank. The Koreans set fire to their ship, at which point all the other men on board tried to escape, but were killed by the soldiers on the riverbank. Thomas alone remained on board, and he threw all the Bibles he'd brought with him to those watching on the banks of the river. Eventually, he jumped into the river with his clothes ablaze. Reaching the bank, he begged a soldier to receive his last Bible as a gift. The soldier hesitated, but then fulfilled his duty by thrusting his lance through the 27-year-old Welshman. Those present were deeply impacted by the scene. Some of the Bibles were rescued and the pages were used as wallpaper in people's houses. Within a short period, though, curiosity grabbed them, and they began reading the scriptures on the walls and became Christians despite the massive personal cost that conversion brought them. One young man's life, lived and laid down with such urgency, had led to the expansion of God's fledgling kingdom in that land. Many people talk to us about our calling to God, from God on what we're doing. Many people have a calling from God. Many people would love a calling from God. Many people then think, however, that possibly a calling from God, because he is so mighty and so powerful, is something that maybe has got birds sweetly singing in the background. It's got the sun shining. It's got the butterflies flitting around. And everything is wonderful and lovely and it's all a mountaintop experience. But believe me, so often, a calling from God can be like the calling of that young Welshman, because God knows what he's calling you to do and why he's calling you for it, and he's looking at his purposes and what greater glory can you have than being with him anyway. So that's just a little introduction to the concept that we're looking at of calling today. Calling can be costly. Geraldine's going to share some thoughts from the 22 years of Quicken Trust, a UK Christian charity, as you know, supporting a community in rural Uganda, a place called Kabubu. So I'm going to hand over to Geraldine for a few moments.
So these thoughts and these questions, because we're not saying it's this or it's that, come out of years of asking ourselves these questions. We've had numerous conversations on various aspects of calling and how big was the Kabubu that God calls us to, and should we go elsewhere in Uganda, and a variety of other things. We've also listened very carefully to what people have said to us, sometimes in throwaway conversations which have sparked deeper thoughts within us about what a calling is. We've thought and read lots and lots of books of missionaries and all sorts of other people that have done all kinds of extraordinary things. Some of them, like C.T. Studd and the Cambridge Seven, were people that came from privileged and wealthy backgrounds and gave up whatever it was they had, their glittering careers, because C.T. Studd was a very famous cricketer. They gave all that up to go to China or Africa or some other remote part of the globe. We've also thought about people that God called very ordinary people, like Gladys Aylward, who was convinced God wanted her in China, went to all kinds of missionary societies. Nobody would take her, so she bought a one-way ticket and went off across Siberia and arrived in China, not speaking the language or anything.
It's interesting to note that she wondered why she had been called to China. When she got there, she realized it because, like the Chinese, she was short and dark-haired.
Or William Carey, who was a shoe repairer, who had very little education, but who left the UK and did amazing things in Calcutta, India, and China. And despite the fact that he only went to school for about 12 years, until he was about 12 years of age, when he was out in those countries, he wrote the Bible in numerous languages and learned to speak all those languages, even though he had very little education. So we've looked at, both ends of the spectrum of ordinary people and not such ordinary people who are actually all extraordinary. We have asked ourselves why it is that so few today seem to want to serve Jesus in the developing world. We haven't come up with any answers, by the way, but we've, done a bit of soul searching and thought about that. We've had conversations about why, as a volunteer, for example, people may serve Jesus in their local church, but when they come and work for a Christian organisation like Quicken Trust, they would expect to be paid. Not that we're saying that pay is wrong, but it's almost like in one setting you do one thing and in another setting you do another thing. We have answered questions and or made comments from all sorts of people, comments that have come to us in all sorts of ways. Someone, for example, may say to us in our office, I told my friend I work for Geoff and Geraldine, or I told my friend I work for an interesting charity called Quicken Trust. To this, I might have replied, together, we are serving Jesus in providing healthcare and education for a community in Uganda. Why do I say that? Because we believe that what we work for and what we do and our attitude to the way we work is what really counts. It's not people working for Geoff and Geraldine. It's not people working in this way or that way. in this place or that place, but it's to do with how we work and how we serve Jesus. So people are not working for us, and they're not working for Quicken Trust in Africa. We are all together working with Jesus in the place that he's asked us to do that work, which happens to be right now in Kabubu. So that brings up another question. So is your job work, or is your job a calling? You know, I've heard some wonderful things listening to you today, and I don't know most of you, and I don't know what most of you do, but I heard two ladies indicate that sounded like they were in some sort of care homes or caring professions. I know Janet works as a nurse. You know, is that a calling or is that a job? Because sometimes we get the two a bit confused. In Matthew 25, verse 40, you may remember that Jesus said, I, the King, will tell them, when you did these things in my name, you were doing it to me. What were the things that they were doing? They were giving a glass of cold water, or they were giving food to the hungry. So whatever it is we are doing, we can be doing it for the King of Kings. Sometimes when someone has responded to Quicken Trust adverts, when we put out an advert to do admin work, we may ask them in the interview process, because we're a Christian charity and because we are advertising, you know, that they have to understand the Christian community to be working in it. Tell us why you're interested in working for a Christian charity. We may say something like that. That, in a way, helps us to understand if they really know the Lord, or if they are, I was going to say a Christian with a label on, if you understand what I mean. I'm Church of England, or I'm this, that, or the other. So then some of them will go on to explain how they became a Christian, or they might then talk about how they were led by their circumstances. Maybe they found themselves unemployed, or maybe they heard a sermon, or maybe they had a Bible reading, and they believe now they are called to work for Quicken Trust. So they work well with us for some time, maybe, and they have a good relationship. We have a good relationship with them. And then one day we may ask them to extend themselves and stay on for an extra hour to complete a task when it's really needed, not every day of the week, but when it's something that we're meeting a deadline on. And they respond with something like, I'm only doing that if I'm paid overtime. Now suddenly they're no longer called, they now have their rights. Some may even say, I only work here for the money, or because it's close to home, or it pays well, or it fits in with my family. All good reasons, but suddenly their calling is no longer a calling. It's now the goalposts have shifted, and serving Jesus is no longer doing what it takes, and it's moved from being a calling. So how do we respond to various circumstances in our lives? One of the things that impressed me many years ago, something like 30 years ago, probably, or 40 years ago, when I went to a conference, a Christian conference, there was a speaker there. His name was Ernest Sodi. He's since gone to glory. He was an American, and he was a very good preacher, but he was also running an orphanage in Honduras. And he and his wife had founded this orphanage. I don't remember too much about what he said about Honduras, or about the orphanage, or about life in Honduras. I do remember this story because it really impressed me. He said he went to somewhere in the UK and he preached, and a lady came up to him at the end of the meeting and said, I believe God is calling me to help you in your orphanage in Honduras. And he said, well, blah, 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 chat, chat, chit, chit, chat, chit, chat. What work are you doing now? And she said, I'm a nurse. And he said, that's a really good and worthwhile job. Carry on what you're doing. The next year he came back to the UK again, went to the same place as well as other places. And at the end of his talk, a lady came up to him, the same lady, and said, I believe God has called me to go to Honduras and I can help in your orphanage. And he said, what is your job? She said, I'm a nurse. He said, that's a wonderful thing. You'd be very helpful to me. But right now it looks like, there's a lot of need for you to be doing this in the UK. So she carried on. The third year he came back again to the UK, also returned to this group. The lady turned up again. She came up to him and she said, Ernest Sodi, I believe God has called me to go to Honduras. And she said, I am going to Honduras, whether I go with you or whether I go with somebody else. I believe God is calling me to Honduras. And he said to her, now you're ready to come to Honduras. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but we've recently been advertising for a director to take over our role. We started off with about 10 people on the list. Today we have 2 left that we're going to interview. The process has been rather long because of Zoom and different people's commitments and all sorts of other things, which I won't bore you about, but we're now down to 2. One of them got a job in Switzerland and off he went there. Somebody else decided something else. So the 10 weeks that this has spanned, actually we're now getting down to 2 who may actually be committed. So God sometimes speaks to us in all kinds of other ways, and we hear God sometimes through the circumstances, and sometimes we hear God through a different way of calling. And Geoff is now going to share about an angel who brought a message to somebody which you would call a calling.
Thanks, Geraldine. I'll try and be reasonably quick on this. And it's a story from the Bible, and it involves obviously the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel had been very, very bad. They had denied God. They had gone their own way. And it came to a time when God led the nation of Israel to be taken over by another nation called the Midianites. And there were statues of Baal that were appearing everywhere, and wooden Asherahs, the effigies of a woman that they were was a deity to them. And it says in the Bible that the Midianites came in sort of swarms like locusts. Now, locusts come in huge, great swarms. We had locust swarms this year threatening Uganda. And they were sort of 400 million locusts strong, these swarms. Well, the Midianites weren't quite that number, but they compared to Israel, they were a mighty, mighty nation that completely destroyed the fabric of Israel and took all of their goods, their food, their animals. They took everything that there was. And the Israelites were in absolute fear of the Midianites. And we can tell that because I'm going to tell you a story about a young man. And when the story is introduced, you wouldn't have seen much of him at ground level. All you have seen is something going up above the ground level and down, up and down, and up and down, and up and down. And what was he doing? He was threshing some corn in a wine press. And he was doing it down there because he was terrified of being seen. While he's doing this, suddenly a voice comes. And the voice says, "The Lord be with you, O mighty man of God." this man hiding in the wine press. All you could see was maybe a little, someone coming up and down to sort of thresh the wheat down on the threshing floor. A mighty man of God. He looked up and he saw there was an angel of the Lord was there. And he said, well, you know, if God is with us, why are we suffering so much? You know, how can I be a mighty man of God? That our nation is not a mighty nation of God. The angel's response was, well, you will get your nation free. You can check all this out in Judges 6, verse 11 onwards, by the way. You will get your nation free. This guy hiding down in the threshing pit, scared to death that someone would see him, is a mighty man of God and is going to lead and free their nation. Would you believe that? Strange, isn't it? It was at that moment when Gideon, and that's his name, came up with the sort of question, what I call in verse 15 of chapter 6, that who me, I'm a nobody clause. Who do you think I am? I'm a nobody. And it basically, the next one says, sort of, you know, I'm from the family of the nest, and we're the least of the families, and I'm the youngest in the family. I am a nobody. How can I be a mighty man of God? And the angel of the Lord says in verse 16, I will be with you. No, I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man. You won't be threshing bits of wheat on the floor of the threshing room hiding. You are going to defeat Midian as one man. What a calling. I wonder how Gideon felt about this. Going from being on the threshing room floor to leading the army. I'm sure he had some doubts in there, but what a calling. And he said, look, you know, just to sort of make sure that I understand you and that this is really something that's happening, I want you to stay here until I can sort of prepare something for you, have something, a food, a sacrifice. So the angel says, well, okay, you know, I'll be here for a few more minutes. And so Gideon goes and prepares a kid goat and stews it and bakes unleavened bread. Well, I'm sure that took a bit more than a minute to do, but that's what he did. And he took it out there. The angel was still there, and so put it down on the stone over there, touched it with his staff, burst into flame, and the angel disappeared. Now, I can't see all of you on my screen, but if anyone's had an experience like that, would you please raise your hand? No, I didn't think you would have done. Gideon had been called by God. Now, he must have been excited because he went out and he built something that hadn't been built in this area for many years. He built an altar to God and gave thanks for what had happened. And the altar there would constantly remind him, whatever doubts and fears he might have for the future, he could just look at it and see it as a remembrance. That actually happened. Wow. It really happened to me. It can be exciting to know that God has a particular calling on your life. We all have a calling. Well, we all have a calling to be witnesses. In Mark 16:15, Jesus commissions his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. But you know, sometimes God places a particular call on an individual's life. Then Gideon had a dream. Tear down the altar of Baal and the Asherah. And he found that a bit difficult. Even though he'd been commissioned to be this mighty man, he found that very difficult. And the altar of Baal and the Asherah, they were built as idols of worship, to stone and to wood, as opposed to the true God. But the trouble he had was that his father had built the altar to Baal and put up the Asherah. And I'm sure in his mind, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 came flooding in, that you are to honour your father and your mother. Now, to destroy something his father had built would be dishonouring his father. How do you get round that one? Now, we're looking at the realities of life if you've got a calling. How do you get round that one? Well, he found quite a good way of getting round it, because he took 10 servants out one night in the middle of the night and destroyed it and snuck back home, probably got back into bed, thinking, I got away with that one. But everybody knew that it was Gideon that had done it. Sometimes the call of God can put you in some strange situations. In verse 36, Gideon, in his humanity, because it's now getting to the time where things are really starting to sort of work out on the purpose that God had for him. Gideon wanted more proof. He wanted proof that he actually being called to do this big job. So he said to God, okay, God, I'm going to put a fleece on the threshing room floor overnight. In the morning, it's got to be soaking wet and the land's got to be dry. And if that happens, then I know that's my calling. Do you know what? Of course it was. The fleece was soaking wet. The land was dry. Gideon, still a little unsure of this, even though he'd said, you know, if you do this, I will know. Little unsure of this. And God, I'm sure, looking down, looking at Gideon's humanity, thought, yes, okay. Gideon said, look, if I put the fleece down on the threshing floor again and it's dry in the morning and the ground all around is wet, I really know. And that happened, and the fleece was dry and the ground was soaking wet. And I think Gideon at that point came to accept that he had been asked to do this. Now, it's easy to criticize Gideon, but let's not do that. Sometimes God's calling seems to be totally unreasonable, which it can well be when we look at the task and then look at ourselves. Like Gideon, we so often look at what we think we can achieve. God's calling often asks us to achieve what only God can achieve. And he chooses to do it through us. Our clock is about to bong 5 times. Do excuse me. It's telling us that I've got to finish very shortly. Gideon's story continues. He asked by God to do the impossible with his army of 32,000. God looked at it and said, no, that's too many. And the number is reduced to 10,000. Judges 7, verses 2 and 3. God looks at the 10,000. No, it's still too many. And the number is reduced to 300. Yes, 300. That's good, said God. Judges 7, verse 7. With an army of 300, Gideon, in God's power, led the Israelites to victory over the thousands of Midianites who fled in terror and confusion during the battle that followed. Judges 8:32 tells us that Gideon lived for 70 years, had many more battles, but 40 of those years were in peace and worship of God. Like Gideon, when you receive a particular calling from God, it might seem an impossible task, but with God, all things are possible. Never fear a calling if it has come from God to do the impossible. Be blessed, and as you live out the call in your life. And Geraldine's just got something she wants to share.
Okay, I'm looking at another side of calling. So from what Geoff has shared about Gideon, the call to Gideon came through an audible voice that said, go and save Israel from the Midianites. I'm sending you. I'm in the Living Bible, he's in another version. But the message is the same. God called Samuel as a little voice in the night, or maybe it was a big voice in the night, and you know that story. The disciples heard the call when Jesus said, "Follow me." So they too heard a voice. So does a call only come when we hear a voice, or can it come in other ways? I was looking at the story of Esther, an amazing story, because Esther found herself in circumstances she didn't choose. Her cousin Mordecai was captured and in exile in Babylon in chapter 2, verse 6. Right now, we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. We did not choose this pandemic. Is Trump to blame? Are the Chinese to blame? We don't know. We don't know how it started. We don't know how it will end. But we find ourselves in circumstances that we didn't choose. In verse 7 of chapter 2, we read, not only was Mordecai captured and in exile, but his cousin Esther was an orphan. That is, she'd lost her mother and her father. She was adopted not as a Cinderella type adoption, you know, the Cinderella where you use the extra person in your household, you know, to do the chores you don't want. She was actually far more than that, because we read in verse 7, but she was not like most orphans, because she was raised as his daughter. So she was in a very special relationship. Later on in the same chapter, in verse 11, when we later read that about her being in the court, it says that Mordecai came every day to check on her. So this was a very caring and loving relationship. And our calling has to come out of our relationship with God. We have to believe that he cares more about us than we care about ourselves, because often we find ourselves in extraordinary places and having to exercise a huge amount of trust, faith, to see us through whatever we find ourselves doing. So here we are. Esther is an orphan. We don't know how old she is, but then another very extraordinary circumstance, not of Esther's making, occurs. Because the king, Ahasuerus, has had a difficult relationship with his wife. We won't go into the details of all that. And now he needs another wife. So somebody suggests to him that he sets up a harem. Now, I'm not suggesting we go around and set up harems. But that's where suddenly Esther finds herself. Again, not a place that she would choose to be in. But a circumstances into which it says in verse 8, she was brought. It doesn't say she was taken captive into that harem. It doesn't say she was forced or coerced into the harem. We do know it was not something that she chose, because in no way does it indicate anywhere in the scripture that she chose, but she was brought there. So that involves being brought there, indicates others were involved in that, maybe preparing her for it, maybe selecting her for it, maybe realizing she was extra beautiful, and so that was the ideal place for her. But she, they may have even transported her there. But while she was there, we can read in verse 9 that she made an impression on the people, the person who was running the harem, so much so that they actually spoiled her. They gave her special meals, beauty treatments, a luxurious apartment, and 7 maids. Wow, not bad for a teenage girl. In verse 10, we read that Esther followed her uncle's advice. Her cousin's advice, not uncle. She did not say that she was a Jewess. He had told her not to say this. So this was a trusting relationship where she responded. She listened to him and she did what he said. In verses 12 to 18, we can then read about Esther's one night with the king and his reaction to that when she returned to the harem. And in verse 20, again we read, Esther still had not told anyone she was a Jewess. Why didn't she tell anybody she was a Jewess? Because she trusted what her cousin had told her to not to say that, and so she trusted him. So because she knew he cared, it was a two-way relationship. And ours has to be a two-way relationship with our loving Father to do whatever it is, whether it's to speak to our next door neighbour, whether it's to pray with somebody in the hospital when the NHS says you can't possibly do that, or whatever. When we find ourselves in extraordinary circumstances, sometimes we have to do what we know we have to do. And one day, a little later, Mordecai, her cousin, also found he was in the court, and he overheard two angry officials plotting to assassinate the king. Mordecai gave that information on to Esther. And Esther went and told the king and saved the king's life. Much later still, in chapter 3, verse 2, we read that Mordecai did not bow to the king. The officials were very, very angry that he did not bow to the king. Everybody else bowed to King Ahasuerus as he went by. But Mordecai, as a Jew, stood out and did not bow. So they plotted to, some people in the court plotted to remove him and kill all the Jews to get rid of this one man who refused to bow. Later, Mordecai learnt of this plot to kill him and all the Jews. He fasted, in chapter 4, verse 1, he fasted and prayed. Then he sent a message to Esther with a plan on what to do. In verse 11, Esther replied she could not possibly go in to the king and speak and plead for her life or the life of her people. Again, Esther finds herself in circumstances she wouldn't choose. She says, the king hasn't sent for me for over a month. And Mordecai replied, do you think you're going to escape in the palace when all the other Jews are killed? So there's a Holocaust coming up here. If you keep quiet at such a time like this, God will deliver the Jews from another source, but you will and your relatives will die. What's more, who can say that God has brought you to this palace for such a time as this? And that's where we find ourselves in a pandemic. We find ourselves in circumstances that we would not have chosen, in places we didn't want to go. When we first went to Uganda, we only went at the invitation of a friend and 3 months after making the most ridiculous prayer. If we had actually wanted to serve God, we would have chosen a Caribbean beach. We were rather fancying a beach ministry. Not a landlocked country with AIDS victims, and all we knew about it was that Idi Amin had butchered many of his people there. Our invitation to go there only came out of the blue, and we didn't know that when we returned to support some friends who by then had moved out there, we didn't know we were going to meet 4 orphan children. All we agreed at the end of that was to tell the story of Kabubu in UK, and we agreed to return 100% of anything we raised, which we didn't think we would raise anything, but we thought it might get us out of the village alive. We agreed to return 100% to this one community. God took our little offering and provided for the infrastructure of a community. So a calling then from God may come from a voice in the night. It may come from the bottom of a pit, which I think probably also symbolises when we come to the end of ourselves and we've got to the bottom of everything else we can think of. We're down in the pit and God speaks. A call from God can come when we least expect it, and the call from God might come from the circumstances we now find ourselves in. All of us are in different circumstances than we've ever been in before. We see all around us the pandemic. We see new opportunities. We see opportunities we used to have that no longer exist. We can think back over our 22 years in Uganda, going backwards and forwards to Uganda, of lots of ways in which God has called people, not just ourselves. I'm not going to tell the story, but another time maybe we will. A divine appointment between a chauffeur who drove a taxi in Paris with an American passenger in the back that led to provision for Kabubu. Extraordinary story. We can remember of somebody I met on Polegate railway station that led to us having an electronic record system to record patients, because there was nothing in Uganda at all to record patient visits or whatever, and the medical history, all on Polegate railway station. We can think of a member of staff who went to support her sister at a quiz night in Surrey that led to amazing funding from another charity. It's risky business for Gideon. It's risky business for Esther. Sometimes it's been very risky business, which we haven't time to tell you about today. In the UK, we've had some opposition. In Uganda, we've had all kinds of, and the director out there has had all kinds of undermining of his position. And as Geoff read from the story earlier, sometimes the cost is more than most of us can bear.
Just a couple of things to update you. Thank you, Geraldine, for that. A couple of things to update you on what has happened in Uganda during this past year, which has been a very difficult one because we haven't been able to travel there since February. We had an amazing threat of locusts to decimate the crops come June, July. And I referred to the swarms when I was talking about Gideon. It really was a very serious threat, because these locusts, I forget the precise figures, but a swarm of 100 million, I think, can decimate crops. If you're thinking of a population the size of France, the amount of crops that they can decimate in a day would feed the French for about 3 weeks or something like that. I mean, it is terrible. When you're living in a rural community and you only rely on eating what you can grow, if what you are growing disappears overnight, you have nothing to eat. So thank you for sharing the prayers. We did share this out on Facebook. Thank you for sharing your prayers on that. I'm sure you prayed for that. We're delighted to be able to tell you that the locusts were coming towards Ugandan border and swerve north. So I'm sure they hit a lot of prayers as they were coming to the Uganda border. So thank you for that. The other thing's been the pandemic there. The major things for the pandemic are wash your hands in the early days. Wash your hands, maintain distance, and save the NHS. Well, they don't have an NHS out there. The social distancing is very, very, very difficult, because you've got to think you may get a family of 8 or 9 or 12 in a one-room house that's about 10 feet by 10 feet. So social distancing is very difficult. The washing of the hands was also a problem, because over the years, not that we knew, some of the water pumps had failed to operate because their boreholes, the pipes had rusted and so on. And we just let a few folk know this. We just put something up on Facebook about it. And it was just amazing. The way that God gets people to respond to some of these things blows our little minds away, because we were able to repair all of the boreholes that were there, and we were able to put in, instead of iron pipes, stainless steel pipes, so they should never have the problem again. And the amount of money meant that we could buy so much soap that every family in Kabubu had 2 or 3 deliveries of a kilogram of
Bars
soap.
of soap that big.
And at the moment in Uganda, according to the John Hopkins University, when I last looked, which I must admit, I'm sorry, I didn't look before we came on air today, but there was around about 250 people throughout the entire country had died because of COVID. I would value a prayer on that concept because in Uganda, 80% of it is rural. In 80% of Uganda, which is rural, if someone dies in your family, the tradition is they're buried within 24 hours. There is no way of knowing if that person has died of COVID, malaria, or whatever. And so you've got to think that 80% of the country is like that without the ability to record accurately what people have died of. But I think it's around about 250 to 300 deaths they've had since the beginning of the pandemic. What we can tell you is that our understanding is that Kabubu, there have been no cases of COVID.
No, although some of the staff have got relatives in other parts of Uganda
That have had it, but we're saying in Kabubu there have been no cases of COVID. So thank you for your prayers for that village. The one thing that anybody can do is to pray, and that more than anything else, we covet your prayers for what God is doing out there. And I put it that way: it is what God is doing out there. Because a bit like Gideon, when he said go into Kabubu, and we went there and we saw what was there and we thought, oh no, Lord. But he said yes. And another time I'll tell you how he led me out of full-time work, because that was an experience down in a wine press. But thank you for asking us to share some of our thoughts. Our thoughts have been about the calling, and that's what led us into Kabubu. But to show you how different people can respond to a calling in a different way, and the different ways of God's calling. Sometimes, yes, it is butterflies. Sometimes it is birds singing sweetly. Sometimes it is sunshine. Sometimes it's like that 27-year-old Welshman who was able to give out one Bible and was speared. But God knows why he has called you and what he's called you to do. And he knows the consequences. And if our lives are based in him, we will want to do what he wants us to do. So we praise God for the fact that he's called us, and we're looking forward to seeing what he's got for us to do next. So thank you very much.
Be blessed.
Be blessed.
Amen. Amen.